Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
Dark Stories for the Dead of Night, Volume 2. First story. We lived in Okinawa for a while, a few years ago. I don't believe in ghosts, but I can't explain so many of the events that happened in our apartment. The least scary had to be the boy. My son would describe this little boy that looked like his friend, who was Japanese, and how the boy wanted my son to follow him to the hallway. It was very matter of fact and only happened once. My son then said that the boy was trying to turn into a monster. I tried my best to ignore the goosebumps all over me, and when he said that the boy had a yellow hat on, I almost lost it, but managed to outwardly stay calm. I had been dreaming of a little boy coming to my side of the bed wearing a yellow hat, and then turning to dust. Later, I talked to my friend about it, and she laughed and said the boy had been hiding in her daughter's closet for a year now, yellow hat and all. Soon a new neighbor moved in, and she came banging on my door one night. She said something had grabbed her leg, and she saw a boy in a yellow hat run away. My neighbor didn't know my friend, and I never told her about it. My kids were too young to be out and about talking to the other kids at that point. A local friend told me to put salt across my threshold and scissors out, because scissors signify the end of a relationship in Japan. I didn't feel really threatened until I began dreaming about a woman standing in the doorway of our spare room, staring malevolently at me. I hated going in that room because of the dreams and just a bad feeling I got there. I just always felt uneasy. There was always earthquakes, so little things like toys going off, and especially the phone cord. Yes, we had a landline. Swaying back and forth didn't seem too out of place. One night, I stupidly decided to Google research Ghost of Okinawa, and after a lot of boring stuff I already knew, I found a story that struck a nerve. It described a man whose wife was targeted by a female spirit. It sounded very frightening, and when I finished the story, I was shocked to my very core to discover my actual building listed as their previous residence, which they'd moved out of a month before we moved in. The chances it was the same apartment were slim, but I slammed my laptop cover down and vowed to salt every freaking room in my house, because at least it might ease the tension I felt there, like a placebo. The absolute breaking point came when one of my kids ran screaming out of bed one night, and I found them huddled in the corner, and I swore I heard a set of heavy footsteps as I jumped out of bed. It could have been sleep hallucinations, but I cried and held my child and whispered that we'd leave, and we did. Story number 2. When I was about 14, I was staying up way too late on the computer. It was about 1 or 2 in the morning and everyone else was asleep. I got thirsty and wandered down the hallway to get a drink. I didn't bother to turn on any lights since there was a night light in the hallway and there was enough light to get by. I'm walking back to the bedroom when I got this weird feeling like someone was watching me, and I turned around. There was this big white mist just floating right behind me. I immediately turned around and noped my way back into the safe, bright room. The thing is, there were no shadows facing that hallway, and I hadn't passed the night light yet, so it definitely wasn't a trick of the light. All the doors leading to the hallway were also closed. A few years later, when I was moved to the small room closest to that spot, I got the heebie-jeebies and couldn't sleep without a lamp on. It wasn't until sometime later, after the sighting, that I learned that in the 80s, a guy was renting out the house. He was arrested for the kidnap, rape, and disappearance of a bunch of kids in the area, and for the suspected murder of his wife. They never found her, and she supposedly ran away, according to him. Cadaver dogs went over the farm, but they never found anything. The cops must not have done a good job, though, because when they moved in, my mom found a pair of boys' underwear in the toilet tank. The missing wife was never found, and he died in prison about a decade ago. I think she's still there, though. Story number 3. When I was 12 or 13, we had just moved to the UK from Texas the year before. We moved into the really nice farmhouse in the south of England near Wilton. We were completely alone for at least 3 miles in each direction. Anyway, on with the creepiness. The first time that happened, it was in our kitchen. It was a large room with light fixtures in the ceiling. Those lights were flickering one night, and I was just staring at them. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see a girl. She was wearing a white dress with her hand on the window. It scared the F out of me, so I jumped back and tried to put my focus on her, but when I tried, she was gone, and at that instant, the glass of the light fixture fell. The second thing was slightly more terrifying. I was home alone. It was raining that night. Mom was out somewhere, with friends I think, and I was just watching TV. It was about 9 p.m., and I could hear scratching. Not like a dog scratching the door to go out, like a long, continuous scratch. So I looked around the house and saw nothing. Sat back down to watch TV. I heard it again, but it sounded like it was outside. So I darted out the back door to have a look. Maybe it was a tree in the bad weather, but I saw nothing again. I came back inside and the TV was off and the front door unlocked. I almost pooped in my pants. I ran to get a kitchen knife and my mom's old phone. I hid in the office that was on the ground floor and texted my mom, told her what was going on. She called the cops and they arrived. They had a look around and saw wet boot prints that walked in through the front door, led into the kitchen, and then stopped. There were no exit prints. Next story. My girlfriend and I were visiting my sister who lived in a 200-year-old home in western Massachusetts that used to be a brothel. We were staying in her guest room, which recently had new carpet installed that was rather tall and stiff. This made it quite difficult to open and shut the door. I recall using my body weight to force it shut and needing to yank it open. As I'm trying to fall asleep, I heard something bump the door from the hallway. I assumed this was my sister, her boyfriend, or their dog. A few minutes later, I heard something at the door again, but this time the knob turned. I froze as I saw the knob slowly turn and the door began to open until I saw a shape resembling the silhouette of a young girl. The only child in the house is an infant. I immediately rolled over to my side, closed my eyes, and attempted to convince myself that what I saw was a silhouette of the dog. I don't mention this to my girlfriend or my sister because I didn't want to alarm anyone. Fast forward a few months. My girlfriend and I were returning to western Massachusetts to attend my sister's wedding, and it ends up that we'll be staying in the same room. On the plane, my girlfriend says, "I have something I feel I should tell you about your sister's house." I immediately know where she's going with this. As it turns out, she was awake when the door opened, but she got a better look than I. She described seeing a girl of about 5 or 6 wearing a Victorian-styled nightgown open the door and stare her in the eyes with a penetrating intensity before my girlfriend looked away. I told her my story, and we decided to make sure we drank enough to pass out every night so we won't be awake if we are visited again. Next story. I used to work as a 911 operator in a relatively large metro area. One night at about 3 or 4 a.m., I answered a call from an elderly lady who said she didn't feel good. I tried to get more information about what was wrong. Chest pain, trouble breathing, headache, was she diabetic, etc. Got her address and phone number. She said no one else was home, but the door was unlocked so they could go in. No matter what else I asked about what was wrong, all she would say is, "I don't feel good. Can you please send someone to help me?" After a few minutes, she said, "I'm going to put the phone down for a minute. I need to go to the bathroom." I tried to get her to stay on the line with me. Told her she can do whatever she needs to get ready, but I'd like to be able to stay in contact in case there's a problem. She said, "I'm going to put the phone down. I'll just be a minute." A couple of minutes passed, then the fire department called on the scene, so I just disconnected and didn't think much about it. Told them the patient advised the front door was unlocked and that she was in the bathroom. A couple more minutes, and one of the firefighters called over the air with a weird tone and said, "Fire alarm," which is how they address dispatch. How exactly was this call received? I told them the call was first party from the patient's home approximately 8 minutes before. He didn't respond over the air, but called the desk from his cell phone, which usually only happened when something weird was going on, and that they didn't want it broadcasted since anyone can listen to the radios. On the phone he said, "Are you sure this wasn't a third-party call from a family member or something?" I said, "Negative. Caller advised I don't feel good and said no one else was home. So to the best of my knowledge, the caller is the patient. Have you made contact?" He said, "Yeah, she was in the bathroom like you said, but she's been dead for about 12 hours. Cold to the touch, fully livid, full of rigor. We're going to need a deputy out here." Afterward, we pulled the tapes of the radio and phone calls and checked the timestamps, address, the phone number, and went over everything a few times to see if I missed something. I called them back in the morning after the shift to see if they had any more info, but they were just as weirded out as we were. The phone was in the living room and the patient was in the bathroom, but the call was definitely from that phone. Next story. I was in Girl Guides for years when I was younger, and we'd often take trips around the area. This particular trip we went to Ottawa, and we were staying in the old city jail which had been converted to a hostel. They have this promotion type thing, where if you can stay the entire night on the top floor, which was death row, waiting to walk down the hall to the noose and trapdoor, you don't have to pay. We didn't do that. We were on one of the lower floors, as we were all 10 to 14 years old. But we did do a full guided tour of the jail, which took us down death row to the hanging tower. They had the actual trapdoor fence, so no one would fall through the 3-story hole, and even had a recreation noose hanging over it. The tour guide was really enjoying turning up the spooky factor for this group of easily frightened, giggling girls. So as he was explaining the trapdoor, he gave the noose a nudge, so it chillingly swung back and forth. Moving on to the courtyard, everyone was filing down the stairs, and I hung back a few seconds. I really wanted to get a shot of the tower, but was using a crappy old camera with real film. I had to wait for the noose to stop moving, or else the shot would have an ugly blur in the middle. By the time it was finally still, I was alone, on the floor, but I could hear the others in the stairwell beneath me. Feeling a bit nervous, what with the atmosphere and all, I started rushing a little to get the picture. Just as I was pulling the lens away from my eye, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I jumped and figured I was about to get yelled at for straggling behind. Spun around and just about screamed when I saw no one there. Basically, I threw myself down the stairs. I didn't stop shaking until I was in the middle of the group, surrounded on all sides by friends who were completely ignorant to what I had just experienced. When I did tell them later that night back in the cell that was our hostel room, they all thought I was full of shit, trying to scare them. No blame there. I would have assumed the same if someone else said it. By the next day, I had pretty much forgotten about it, convincing myself that it was probably just my imagination running overboard. I didn't even really think about it again until I got the pictures developed. Swear to God, in the shot I took of the noose and the trapdoor, there's a black outline of a head and shoulders, as if someone was standing right in front of me. I was completely alone at the top of the tower at the time, and the angle doesn't even make sense how someone could be there. What did I do with the picture? In typical 13-year-old girl fashion, I made a scrapbook page with it, cut the edges with crazy scissors, and with big black foam letters wrote "Ghosts." My parents still have it somewhere buried with all my other childhood creations. Next story. This happened to a friend of mine a few years ago when he and his wife were hiking in the Gold Coast hinterland in Queensland, Australia. After a good day's hike, they stopped at the rest stop to use the bathroom before heading back to the car. The bathrooms at the rest stop were compost toilets, so the block of toilets were positioned on top of a large tank. The waste goes in the tank and breaks down naturally, and in the winter months often shoots a blast of cool air up the bum of anyone using them. My friend's wife went to use the ladies while he waited outside. She'd not been in there long when he heard her scream and rush out of the toilet. It's Australia, so there are many reasons for running out of a bush toilet screaming, as in snake spiders, drop bears, Ivan Milat, but this one takes a cake. "There's a man in the toilet!" My friend was confused. His wife explained to him that she'd gone to the loo, and after she finished, she'd look down into the tank. Come on, morbid curiosity would get the better of you, too. And there, submerged in liquid poop, she saw a bald man staring up at her. He didn't believe her, but she was adamant he'd go look. So he went into the ladies, and with a flashlight from his iPhone, he illuminated the pool to get a better look. He couldn't see anything, but she was certain there was someone hiding in the tank watching people use the toilet. As they were leaving and still arguing about it when they were approached by a man. "Excuse me, but did you see something weird in the toilet?" My friend's wife answered. "Yes," the man replied. "Was it a man?" He and his girlfriend had been hiking the weekend before, and his girlfriend had seen the same thing. They all ran back up the toilets for a second look. When they reached the door, they heard a sound from behind the toilet block. My friend and their new acquaintance went around the back of the toilet block to check it out, while his wife looked in the tank from the bowl. At the back of the tank, the top hatch had been opened, the bolt and chain had been removed, and a telltale brown smudge seemed to suggest someone had slid down the bank of the tank and taken off into the bush. Next story. I had just moved into my first apartment and was in the process of moving in. The door that led into my apartment locked itself automatically when closed. So I was going to the entrance to the apartment complex to get my mail while talking on the phone with my boyfriend. I returned to my apartment and sat on the bed while opening the mail and also talking on the phone. I dropped the phone on the floor and it landed under the bed, so I had to lie on the floor and stretch for it. I saw something that caught my eye. There was someone under my bed. My eyes widened and I choked the urge to scream. The person under my bed was lying still with his back towards me and his head to his chest, so I couldn't see his face, and he didn't see me. Trying to be rational while so many thoughts rushed through my head, I picked up the phone and said, "Sorry I dropped my phone. I'm just gonna take a shower and call you back." The bathroom is right by my bed, so I hastily walked in and quietly locked the door, turned the shower on, jumped out my window, my apartment was on the first floor, and called the police. They told me to wait nearby, but to go across the street and see if anyone came out the door of the apartment complex. This was during summer and it was still light out. I placed myself across the street, hiding behind a car, and watched my open bathroom window and the entry door. I called my boyfriend and he came to me just before the police. I gave them my keys and they went inside. Only moments later, 2 cops came out holding a thin and tired-looking man. His eyes looked crazy, but he didn't try to get away. The policeman that had stood beside me and comforted me while the police searched through my house, I was a mess, shivering and crying, told me that the man stood outside my bathroom door with one of my kitchen knives waiting for me to come out. This man had somehow crept in my entry door while I was getting my mail and hid under the bed. The man that was trying to hurt me turned out to be a homeless person and was placed in a mental hospital. My boyfriend moved in with me the very next day. Next story. About 5 years ago, I lived downtown in a major city in the U.S. I've always been a night person, so I would often find myself bored after my roommate, who was decidedly not a night person, went to sleep. To pass the time, I used to go for long walks and spend time thinking. I spent 4 years like that, walking alone at night, and never once had a reason to feel afraid. I always used to joke with my roommate that even the drug dealers in the city were polite, but all of that changed in just a few minutes one evening. It was Wednesday, somewhere between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I was walking near a police-patrolled park quite a ways from my apartment. It was a quiet night, even for a weeknight, with very little traffic and almost no one on foot. The park, as it was most nights, was completely empty. I turned down a short side street in order to loop back to my apartment when I first noticed him. At the far end of the street, on my side, was a silhouette of a man, dancing. It was a strange dance, similar to a waltz, but he finished each box with an odd forward stride. I guess you could say he was dance-walking, headed straight for me. Deciding he was probably drunk, I stepped as close as I could to the road to give him the majority of the sidewalk to pass me by. The closer he got, the more I realized how gracefully he was moving. He was very tall and lanky and wearing an old suit. He danced closer still, until I could make out his face. His eyes were open wide and wild, head tilted back slightly, looking off at the sky. His mouth was formed in a painfully wide cartoon of a smile. Between the eyes and the smile, he decided to cross the street before he danced any closer. I took my eyes off of him to cross the empty street. As I reached the other side, I glanced back, and then stopped dead in my tracks. He had stopped dancing and was standing with one foot in the street, perfectly parallel to me. He was facing me, but still looking skyward, smile still wide on his lips. I was completely and utterly unnerved by this. I started walking again, but kept my eyes on the man. He didn't move. Once I had put about half a block between us, I turned away from him for a moment to watch the sidewalk in front of me. The street and sidewalk ahead of me were completely empty. Still unnerved, I looked back to where he had been standing to find him gone. For the briefest of moments I felt relieved until I noticed him. He had crossed the street and was now slightly crouched down. I couldn't tell for sure due to the distance and the shadows, but I was certain he was facing me. I had looked away from him for no more than 10 seconds, so it was clear that he had moved fast. I was so shocked that I stood there for some time staring at him, and then he started moving toward me again. He took giant, exaggerated, tiptoed steps, as if he were a cartoon character sneaking up on someone, except he was moving very, very quickly. I'd like to say at this point I ran away, or pulled out my pepper spray or my cell phone or anything at all, but I didn't. I just stood there, completely frozen, as the smiling man crept toward me. And then he stopped again, about a car length away from me, still smiling his smile, still looking to the sky. When I finally found my voice, I blurted out the first thing that came to mind. What I meant to say was, "What the F do you want?" in an angry, commanding tone. What came out was a whimper like, "What the f—" Regardless of whether or not humans can smell fear, they can certainly hear it. I heard in my own voice, and that only made me more afraid. But he didn't react to it at all. He just stood there smiling. And then, after what felt like forever, he turned around very slowly and started walking away. Just like that. Not wanting to turn my back to him again, I just watched him go until he was far enough away to be almost out of sight. And then I realized something. He wasn't moving away anymore, nor was he dancing. I watched in horror as the distant shape of him grew larger and larger. He was coming back my way, and this time he was running. I ran too. I ran until I was off the side road and back into a better lit road with sparse traffic. Looking behind me then, he was nowhere to be found. The rest of the way home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, always expecting to see a stupid smile, but he was never there. I lived in that city for 6 months after that night, and I never went out for another walk. There was something about his face that always haunted me. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look high. He looked completely and utterly insane. And that's a very, very scary thing to see. Next story. I live in northern Australia, and everyone growing up in my town knows the legend of the Poinciana woman. A quick Google search will elaborate into the many variations to the story, but the one I grew up to know is that of a woman who was raped by Japanese fishermen who hanged herself from a poinciana tree when she discovered she was pregnant. She is said to appear as a beautiful woman to entice men with long dark hair dressed in a white gown, and is said to be situated at our Army Reserve. When I was around 12 and my younger brother 10, he had been in his room and I was in the lounge room on the computer. He came barreling out from his room screaming, "Can you hear that? Can you hear that?" before dragging me over to the window. There was a faint feminine moan or hum. We could hear it moving from the window we stood at to the one across the room and back in a clockwise direction. The wind had picked up with the noise despite how still the night had been. The sound became so loud that we were on the floor covering our ears, crying. When I brought it up recently to my brother, he agreed that it was almost as if the sound had been in our heads. This went on for about 10 minutes before abruptly stopping. No wind, nothing. We found out the next day that our older sibling had been at the Army Reserve that night before they got home. He had climbed the concrete pillars to the locked gun turret and had been taunting the Poinciana woman before they left when they heard footsteps, assuming it was a security. What creeps me out the most is that not long after this happened, I realized that we had a Poinciana tree outside of our window. Next story. We have a story in Venezuela. It's about a being called Elsie Bone, which translates into the whistler. Typical of the wetland plains and prairie regions we call llanos. Descriptions are usually of a very emaciated man dressed in a cowboy's rags with a wide-brimmed hat that hides his skeletal face. He roams the countryside in patches of bush at night, with drooping shoulders, downcast stare, and a heavy bag full of bones and half-decomposed remains slung over his back. There were two distinctive features, however, that make him particular. He continuously whistles a high chord progression that goes higher in tune with every note, and that he is unnaturally tall and strong, with some accounts describing him as towering over 6 meters in height. His origin is not clear, with some tales stating him as an accursed parricide, but whatever he is, he's feared by lone travelers, especially drunk or unfaithful men that travel through the country. Story has it that his ominous whistle is suddenly heard very loud and close, yet the source cannot be pinpointed, and contrary to logic, when the sound gets lower and appears more distant, it is an indication of his immediate proximity. He will then kill by strangling or by concussion and devour the victim and throw the bones in the bag. He can be seen occasionally waiting over the high walls of haciendas or fincas, and honest prayers are said to keep him away. Next story. In the northeast United States, there's a story about woods people or man-o'-woods. When you're driving along a road in the woods and you catch a glimpse of what looks like a person in the corner of your eye, but when you look directly, it's gone, they say you might have encountered a man-o'-woods. They're a master of camouflage and can sense when someone looks at them. They come to a halt so you can't sense any movement. It's speculated that they wear bark, mud, moss, and grasses to blend in. They're supposedly human, but extremely simple-minded, barely verbal. They're very small in stature and avoid contact with civilization mostly. Nobody knows where they live or congregate, but they usually move on if there's too much activity around. They're also peaceful. Around some farmlands, they will do very simple chores at night or off in the distance. They may sweep a barn floor or stack some wood, but anything more complex is beyond them. They do in exchange for not bothering them as they sleep in the barn for a night or for some bread and vegetables left out for them to find. They've never been known to steal or kill animals or livestock. Next story. This is actually my husband's story. When he was in high school, he and some of his friends had a camp out at his friend's aunt and uncle's house in the country. They did the usual cooking out, putting up a tent, etc. At some point during the night, my husband went for a short walk near a small pond on the property to take a leak. As he was doing his business, he looked up and saw a man walking around the edge of the pond towards him. He clearly saw this man, who was walking with his head down. He described him as wearing a red flannel shirt, jeans, and work boots. He thought this was very strange that this guy was out walking around a pond in the country in the middle of the night. So he said, "Hey man, what are you doing?" He didn't get an answer, and the guy kept walking past him and was now facing away when suddenly he just wasn't there anymore. My husband went and told his friends what happened. The boy, whose relatives owned the property, was shocked and immediately ran to the house and woke them up. He had my husband describe what he had seen. The boy's aunt immediately started to cry. She had been seeing the same guy in the house, sometimes standing at the foot of the bed, and her husband did not believe her. She was so relieved that someone had been able to validate what she had been experiencing. As to who that man in the red flannel shirt was, that still remains a mystery. Next story. I never even met him. I didn't know his name or his face. I was blissfully unaware of his very existence. I will never know why or when it started. I'm glad for that, I guess. I moved into my very small apartment in February last year. My landlord Olivia was a sweet older woman who would cook too much and bring me much appreciated leftovers. She was great to me, even after telling her my problem. I'm antisocial, but she didn't mind renting to a reclusive young girl who reminded her of her daughter. Every few weeks she would knock on my door, then leave, letting me know she was leaving something for me. I loved that. Not even my family would cook so well. The next morning I washed and leave her the empty containers outside my door, and by an hour or so she would take them back. My other neighbors seemed fine, but I never talked or visited with them. I worked from home, so any time I was ever forced to go out, I'd rush out and into my apartment, avoiding an uncomfortable situation. I loved living alone. It was everything I hoped for. I could just breathe. By April, though, I started noticing things were not right. They were moving or plain disappearing. I was convinced it was just anxiety caused by my new medication and the move. Another side effect was that it would make me drowsy. Since I hated seeing the doctor, I just dealt with it. I took naps during the day now and eventually stopped caring. To one incident doubled my paranoia. Olivia brought me some sort of Greek tossed salad and dressing for lunch one day, and I enjoyed it with my friend Netflix. I fell asleep in the middle of Portlandia and woke up that evening at 5 p.m. Per usual, what was not unusual was my bedding on the opposite side of me was disturbed. I only sleep on the right side, always. Even more of it was that it felt warm. My first thought was that I must have rolled around a lot, but I knew it was too odd to dismiss. I got up and searched my apartment, gripping my phone with 911 typed in. Nothing else was disturbed. Everything was exactly like it should be. I let it go. For the next few weeks, everything was normal. Pardon the occasional misplaced shoe or drawn back shower curtain. I thought about telling someone, my parents, maybe Olivia. But if it's not life or death, I am not reaching out to anyone. I wasn't scared. I was nervous. Maybe a little stubborn, but I stayed. I was not letting someone or my stupid anxiety ruin my lovely, lonely world. May came, and it was getting worse. My panties, toothbrush, hell, even my food was being misplaced. Every time I woke up, there was this strange odor in the air. I finally realized this wasn't going to go away by ignoring it. I called my mom and begged her to come and stay a few days. When I got home, I told them everything. Saying it out loud solidified any creepy suspicions. That weekend, my dad went to my apartment, and what he found was true horror. Written all over the walls, "Come back, baby, please." He ran out and called the police. There was no one living in my apartment, but someone definitely had access besides me. The investigation revealed a man named Henry, the son of my landlord Olivia, who was in a projected relationship with me. They showed me his confession on tape. He admitted coming into my apartment every night and every day with his mother's extra key. He claimed that we were in love, and he had my permission. He drugged his mother's food that she left out for me, causing my drowsiness, and I would fall asleep, so he would come in and watch me sleep, touch my hair, kiss my shoulder. The leftovers I had in the fridge were tested and confirmed. I was absolutely horrified and disgusted. A man I never knew existed collected my drained hair, clothes, and trash, and practically lived in my apartment for 4 months.